My name is Gerry Conneely and I was born in Kinvarra, but that's another story. I've been around Galway for 50 years. In fact, I've had 3 incarnations in Galway. I existed in Galway in 3 different epochs of Galway's recent evolution. I was here in the 70s, then I was away for 10 years. I was here for the 90s, then I was away for 10 years, and then I came back after 2010. So I was here for the teens. And what I have in my head is 3 separate Galways. The people that were there in the 70s, the people that populated the dramatis personae of Galway in the 1970s, they disappeared. They were replaced in the 80s by a completely different bunch. There was no connection between them. And then back in the teens, it was exactly the same thing. So I thought if I gave you a picture, give you an idea of life in the 70s as I experienced it. I was a teenager and then an early 20-year-old person in the 1970s. The 1970s I consider to be my particular decade. And what characterized the 1970s, I was a student in Galway, what characterized the students of the 1970s was a tremendous optimism that was ultimately was probably ill-founded, but it gave us hope. Where there's optimism, there's hope. And one of the things that often struck me about today's young people is that they do lack the optimism that we acquired in the 1970s. And this optimism was fueled by an extraordinary event that occurred. It's little recognised in Ireland in 1968. The Minister for Education at the time, Donogh O'Malley, during a drinking session in the Gresham Hotel with his mates, as you can imagine, a corporate group sitting around looking for that particular thing that was going to change society, that was going to make society different. The Tories in England are furiously searching, everybody in England is furiously searching for exactly the same thing. What's going to electrify the population? What's going to really make a difference, rather than just sailing along in the normal way? And they came up with an idea. And this idea crystallized, as it often does during a late night drinking session. This story now is testament to the political benefits of serious heavy drinking. Donogh O'Malley went home and spent the night pondering what they'd been talking about. And he got up in the morning and he decided to call a press conference without consulting the government, without talking to Jack Lynch, who was the Taoiseach at the time. And he announced to the people of Ireland what his plan was. And his plan was to provide free 3rd level and 2nd level education to everyone in the country that wanted it, right? This went out, O'Malley went into hiding for the rest of the morning, and an apoplectic Jack Lynch ran around the place looking for him to sack him. But by the time Jack Lynch found him, it was apparent that the whole country was highly supportive of this idea, thought that it was a great idea. And people were saying, but it's going to cost us billions, we're not going to be able to afford it. But public demand for it was so great. And it came into being, it happened. And this was precisely the reason that during the 1970s, hundreds of thousands of young people right across rural Ireland, cities, but especially rural Ireland, went to university, got a professional qualification rather than getting on the boat and going to England working in building sites. It had a profound transformation. It creased the country financially, right? And the weight of the thing itself went on for years, because most of us initially became teachers, and that seemed like a complete waste of time. But people realized that in order to get to university, they had to get to secondary school. So the secondary system expanded radically during the late 1970s and 1980s. So all those teachers were required. But most of the engineers and the doctors, the serious, what do they call it, the STEM people, they all left the country, and people were wondering how in bad times, when they happened again in the 1980s, we were able to afford to educate all these people that were immigrating out of the country. But then in the 1990s they came back and brought a massive amount of foreign investment into the country with them and basically rebuilt the country. But in reality, that was the primary political event that occurred in the second half of the 20th century in Ireland. It actually changed the country. It was a singular event. So that was the reason that there was hundreds of thousands of people drinking like heavily in Galway during the 1970s. Now, that was the other thing about the 1970s. Drink hadn't acquired the negative complexion that it has acquired today. Drink was something that everybody engaged in, everybody was familiar with it, and the whole thing had a pretty good press. So an awful lot of what we did in Galway during the 1970s was fueled by serious drinking. I worked in Riley's in Foster Street during my time in college in Galway, and that was the busiest pub in Galway. Didn't open until evening. It opened at 8 o'clock in the evening. By 8:30 it was packed. And it was packed until we cleared it at about 12:20 at night. It was a 4-hour shift inside in Riley's in Foster Street for £4. That was the wages at the time. It was the busiest pub in Galway. It had swept along with the ballad boom of the 1960s, and the Rabbit Brothers were the people that were playing there at the time. It was so busy that we were working the bar, and the bar was near the front of the pub. And if you wanted to go to the toilet, what you had to do is you had to run across the road to Cullen's or Hollywood. It was quicker to go to another pub and go to the toilet than try to go to the pub in Riley's itself, because it was so packed. But yeah, I remember the place was falling down because not a bob was being spent in it. The Christmas decorations were up and open all year round. And I remember one night my brother came in to me early before it got busy to talk to me about something. And when I looked around at the bar and looked back at him, he had fallen. His stool had gone down through the floor. It was that decrepit. But one night while running across to Cullen's to go to the toilet, I heard a musician playing in Cullen's, and I thought it was the most amazing fiddle playing I ever heard. And I stopped and I was looking around as I ran out the back door, because the toilet in Cullen's was out the back, and I was looking back anyway, listening to this guy, when I tripped over his friend who was lying prone outside the back door and nearly killed himself. But the musician was Mickey Finn, and the guy that was lying prone on the floor outside the back was his friend Corky. They were two well-known characters in the 1970s. The main pub in town that all socialite floated around was the Cellar Bar. And I can say authoritatively that I drank with some of the greatest alcoholics in Galway of the 1970s in the Cellar Bar. And one gentleman I remember well was called Anthony. I won't reveal his full name, but he was the last of an old gentry family that stretched back to Cromwellian times, and he joined the university sometime in the 50s, I presume, and liked it and just enjoyed the bohemian life of the town. So we were all about 20 or 18 or 19, and Anthony was about 50. But Anthony disappeared one time anyway and couldn't be found. So expeditions were launched around the town in order to unearth him, to find out where he was. And nobody came to anything. But one of his mates called, what was his name? He was from Kerry. We had a particular name for him anyway. He brought me with him, and he went down to Anthony's door, and he knocked the door, and he shouted his name. And we had a particular name now for your man, for Anthony, but I can't remember what it was. But he shouted, we'll say his name was Sean. He says, Sean, I have 50 pounds in my pocket and not a friend in the world. Well, Anthony came out the door so quick, he almost left his profile in the door behind him. He recovered so quickly. The other pubs in town, what you had in the town in the 1970s is you had political pubs. For instance, Mick Taylor's would be a Marxist Leninist pub, a sticky pub. Cook's Corner would be a Bolshevik pub, and Garrivan's would be, what was your man's name? He was the commander of the Red Army during the Civil War. He got murdered in Mexico. Young people were very politicized and on the left. I would say that since then they probably have changed substantially. What you had the Troubles in the North was the background to all radical political thinking. And of course in the 1970s, if you were a student, you automatically were a radically political thinking person. And all the radically political thinking people in the 1970s sort of gravitated to the left in one form or another. But student activity would sort of focus more on the lefty side of things. And then you had the introduction of rock and roll and music from all over the place. And then you had the sort of expansion of trad music internationally, and music started affecting this political atmosphere as well. And this music tended to be played in public houses, So public houses became the absolutely central focus of all kinds of activity in that time. If you were basing a play in the 1970s, you definitely have to base it inside in a pub, because that's where all the action happened. If you were setting one in the 1950s, like the famous playwrights of old were doing, you set it in the kitchen, because that's where the business of life was transacted in the time. But 1970s, the action was inside in the pub. But so the atmosphere around about Galway, with all the student activity and all the mad partying and the wild optimism, all seemed to fuse. Well, I suppose we were fortunate. What happened? Something happened in the late 1970s. The Druid was formed, I'd say. And that initial group became extremely important. Then you had Ollie Jennings and a few other people who promoted various kind of musical events from outside, and things that were a bit not normal or things that were a bit interesting, and developed a market for that. And then in the 1979 they launched the Arts Festival, and then that ran through Galway during the 1980s. And at the time the Arts Festival was a generative social thing, right? It involved half the town to do things in the festival, and various groups were able to feed in and be a part of that event. But big companies like Nortel in the town invested thousands and thousands so the city participated in the design of the festival. And the festival on the one hand was okay to promote tourism, but it was also designed to promote art and the development of art and the capacity for arts development within the city. And that energized the city. Now, for the whole of the 1980s, I missed all this evolution. I was in Dublin teaching, right? And then in 1989, I escaped the theatre profession, right? And escaped Dublin, because I didn't like Dublin, right? And I couldn't wait to get back to Galway again, where this renaissance was going on. And this became this artistic excitement, right? Combined with all the drinking, because that all was still going on, combined with all kinds of other things as well. But the 90s had its own energy, which was different to the 1970s, which was much more generative and much more exciting. So in the town at the time, you had the Druid, obviously, but you had a myriad of, well, you didn't have a myriad, but you had 5 or 6 other companies, amateur companies, all of whom were making interesting theatre and stuff like that. So I acted in rakes of those at the beginning, and then I started directing and acting and writing and all that kind of stuff. Sort of immersed myself in that scene during the 90s. But at the time, because we often talk about this, what was the ingredient, what was the electricity, what was the yoke that was driving this kind of force in the 1980s, and it was an energy, and I suppose that was the critical thing, and it was very difficult to describe how and where and what, but it was just one of the extraordinary things that happened in the period, and it was unique to Galway, was that a thriving lunchtime theatre industry developed in the town, and there was all kinds of groups in it. There was the Flying Pigs, there was the Mad Susans, which I thought were the best ones. They had a show one time called Oliver Cromwell, the Musical. You can imagine, it was sort of new comedy, but it was brilliant stuff altogether. And there was the comedy coming, and that was a show that I was involved in, right? And we had mighty crack with this show. And older people like myself will remember in the early 90s, because we were doing it for a year and a half. It ran forever in the King's Head in Galway. So how did these kind of things work? Well, about 5 or 6 years ago, myself and a few of the lads and ladies, we attempted to see if we could make the whole lunchtime, see if it would take root again, if it could happen again. So I went to all the groups around about up and down the town that, where we drew our customers from. Now, we drew them from 2 sources. One was during the summer, you had tourists. But tourists in the 1990s used to come with cars and things like that, and they were making their own tour up as they went along. They hadn't pre-planned everything out on the internet about 6 months before they arrived in Ireland, right? So we used to go down the town and we used to do this act. Tommy Tiernan was in it now. Tommy became famous while we were doing this show, which was the most extraordinary thing. But what it was this: I was a Christian brother, right? And it was a satire on religious education, right? Religious knowledge was the name of the thing. And so I was this, archetypal lunatic of a Christian brother. And then Tommy was the stupid lad. And Philip Sweeney was the bold fella. And Gerry McSweeney was the goody, right? So the whole thing consisted of baiting and roaring and shouting and all kinds of pranks and all this kind of stuff that, you can imagine at this particular period in this time. So we'd go out on the street and we'd run down the street, stop all the traffic, the lads had to sing a little bit of a song, so we'd do that, and then they'd all be Blackguard and the Christian brother, and he'd be trying to get them all together again. And so we made a bit of a drama out of the street thing, and we used to draw them down, and did very well out of the thing, right? Yeah. But then something happened when we were doing that show, and it's indicative, I think, of comedy. The notion of comedy itself changed, right? A series of programs on the television called States of Fear. There was a bit of a shake-up in television in the early 1990s. The old shticks were displaced in news and current affairs, and they were replaced by the feminists and the Republicans. The Sinn Féin was trying to get Gerry on the television. And the feminists were going to strike the clergy, right? So States of Fear was the first offering, and it was about the Magdalen laundries, and the whole country was in shock. And then a whole series of awful stories of child abuse came pouring in, right? So all of a sudden, the whole idea of this Christian brother in a long thing being absolutely violent and mad and abusive, that 2 years before had people rolling in, suddenly became gothic and unfunny, do you know what I mean, itself. So that whole thing changed, but that's one of the things that happened, And I remember a couple of times it happened, some poor creature now that would be hunched over a bottle of something would see this Christian brother shouting at the lads down the town, and he'd stand up and he'd start roaring abuse and things like that, you know. And obviously those things had meaning, but all of a sudden we became aware of that, you know. So that was, yeah, and then I made a desperately bad mistake producing a show, because we were firing on all kinds of nostalgia, you know what I mean, and nationalist fervour, you know, and the provosts were doing the same kind of thing, and the media, you know, trying to sway people's opinion at the time, and so you had all, you know what I mean, that whole clash went on at the time as well. But that was, so I had to go I lost a rake of money, so I had to go working up in the peace process up in the north to get some consultancy money to bail myself out here in Galway. So I would have been working along the border and in Derry and in Belfast during and at the end of the peace process. There was a political movement, or a whole, we'll say, community development movement that was designed to support the peace process in the north at the time. And it consisted of you know, enterprise, getting people animated, and because the economy on both sides of the border was radically affected by the troubles that had gone on there for 30 years. I mean, the whole country was radically affected, but that area itself. So there was a lot of money put into reanimating projects, and this was done through various bodies, rakes of them up in the north of Ireland, you know. So when you're working in the arts in Galway, you spend all your time looking for money, you know what I mean? That's what it's all about. So, you know, that's a skill that's, you know what I mean, that was marketable at the time, you know. But it was an interesting experience as well, you know. So basically what I was doing was trying to form partnerships, you know, cross-community partnerships. Because if you could convince some crowd on the other side, you know what I mean, I would have gone in there now from the south to, you know, the Bogside and Rosemount and Derry, and you were looking for partners, you know, Protestant partners to do things, you know, and if you could get a cross-community element in the thing, that you know, you were more likely to get money for it, you know. So I was there, the fellow that was trying to sell, you know, European money, you know, and peace process money to loyalist groups and things like that, because they're the ones that are on the community developments, you know. And that regardless of what we, you know what I mean, let's just take the money and run, you know. And so I would be that cynical on it, you know. And but the loyalists would be saying things like, Chair, do you not realise that Europe is a papist plot? and you had this sort of 1790s conversation going on at the same time. But having said that, you know, being the energy, you know what I mean, that existed there at the time, and the people and their experience and their situation it was quite extraordinary to behold, you know what I mean? It was an extraordinary thing, you know. And you'd come down to Galway then, at you know, every three weekends, you know what I mean? You'd come down, you'd be up in Shawnee Nafton drinking pints, or down in Taylor's, and it was like going into a different dimension, do you know what I mean? Up in the north now, this time of the year, this would be in the wake of the 12th, right? And there would have been a whole process of awful things that would have been happening, do you know what I mean, around about now. Everyone that could would be gone out of Northern Ireland at this particular time, you know what I mean, to be safe, you know what I mean. So if you were owed money, you know what I mean, by the 1st or 2nd or 3rd of July, you could be out of luck until September, you know what I mean. Yeah, it was a strange time there, where the atmosphere used to get pretty chaotic, yeah. You come down to Galway then, you know what I mean, and nobody gave two damns about the Garavaghey Road or what was, whereas in the north, everyone would be, you know what I mean, uptight and watching, you know, where, you know, No, there was great fun, you know, but there was always a bit of tension. And one day, I was bringing this friend of mine, and he would have been a prominent paramilitary, because all the people in that area in the north at the time would all be ex-paramilitaries. That's where people were going. You know, that was the exit strategy. But it was his birthday, and it was my job to deposit him at the Pint, you know what I mean, where he was going to be surprised that it was his birthday. And we were driving around Derry, right? And then I was looking for fags. So we went to the Bogside Bar, because our office was just up the road in the city, up the hill. So I went around to where you get the Booksy tobacco, you know. That was the IRA's tobacco. That's where everybody used to buy their tobacco, you know what I mean. But I went around and I was asking him to, you know, will you go into I was trying to get him to go in ahead of me into the bar, and I'd been after him in a minute. But he opened the door of the bar, and everybody was expecting him. And there was a whole line of people inside in it, and they all had, that time the people had, you know, flashes and cameras. And you opened the door, and the next thing there was flashes, right? And the next thing he came falling out the door, and I was looking at his face. He just thought he'd been shot. It took him, do you know what I mean? It took him a while to recover, you know, and you'd be out in the car park afterwards, and you'd hear a description, you know, you get a description of their curriculum vitae, you know, and to put the hair standing on the back of your head. But it was, and then you come down here, and and it took about 20 seconds, and that was gone, you know. And one year I managed to bring a fellow. I had a friend who was working on the other side in Derry. He was a young prod, right? And we were, you know what I mean. He was the fellow that was trying to do the community thing, you know. So it was a good. Myself and himself used to get on well. But he was an apprentice boy, you know. He was really, because he'd be dealing with the likes of myself, you know, he'd have to be very staunch in the other side. And he was Presbyterian, and he had the short haircut and the wire glasses, you know what I mean. And he's a fella that would appear with a collared and tie and a jacket and things like that. You'd have to spend time in Northern Ireland, but you'd be able to tell. You literally could tell looking at people which side of the fence they were on. It was most extraordinary. It didn't take too long to do it either. Jonathan was one of those, and I was always trying to get him to come down to Galway, you know. And you know, he thought now that going as far as Letterkenny, do you know what I mean? You were still in Apache country, you know what I mean? And but one time, one weekend anyway, myself and himself headed down, and he couldn't. We went into that coffee shop there, the Café de Cutie we used to call it. I don't know what it is. It's there below the quays on the left, you know, along there. And there was a crowd that I knew in there, so we were all sitting down talking. And after about 5 minutes anyway, Jonathan was looking at the thing, right? And I said to everybody, I says, lads, Jonathan is a prod. Right? And Jonathan nearly got a heart attack. You know, in the north, like, you just couldn't. The last thing you would say, you know what I mean? And everybody looked like that. He nearly got a heart attack. But so we were good, and I was doing this kind of thing with him, you know. But saying somebody was a prod didn't make any fucking difference to the crowd, you know, that we were there. And he was able to see that as well. But didn't we go next door to the quays? The quays was just opened. You know, the big back of the quays was after being done up, and it was now being open. And it was Courch in Galway that time of the year. And myself and Jonathan went in. And Anne Kennedy, she used to be a poet, American woman, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful woman, Anne Kennedy. She was living here for years. She had been married to Mark Kennedy. Oh, yes. Do you know what I mean? And she came, yeah. She was a beautiful soul and a spirit, actually. Now, she was a very important figure around about the town as well. The Tafts would have been They were the genuine old aristocracy. They were European aristocracy. They were part of the wild geese that went to Austria, Hungary, and there was a Taft in the early part of the 1800s, who was the economics minister to Marie Therese and to the Empress of Austria, and he was an Irish Taft. So the Tafts came back to Ireland sometime during the 19th century. So she had a kind of an aristocratic background. And she definitely had a bearing, you know. She had that, what would you call it, when people can afford to be careless. There's a kind of a word for it, you know.
Yeah.
She didn't much mind what anybody else thought, you know.
Do you have a load of dogs in?
She had maybe 20 dogs, you know. You'd be talking to her and she had a massive big bosom, and a dog could appear up out of her out of her thingamajig. She was extraordinary, and you'd walk into the place, and the smell of dog shit would hit you like a hammer, you know, when you'd go in the door, and the place would be full of this time of the year now, of people buying Arden sweaters. She had the best of stuff, and I mean, they must have been washing the smell of them. Do you know what I mean? Because the smell inside in the place was powerful. But she definitely had that authenticity, you know. But she belonged to a time, you know, people think that this is a liberal time. Mrs. Taft lived precisely the life that she wanted to live and be the way she wanted to be. You know, and I remember the time she was actually removed legally, you know, forcibly from the house and brought out to a care home. And I thought it was a grave injustice, you know, to take the woman, you know what I mean, the place, she was in the way at that stage. That building is valuable, you know, during the Celtic Tiger and all that kind of stuff. And the next thing, she was gone. And Galway has become a bit like that, you know. It's not a place for individual operators, you know. And I think that artists are individuals primarily, you know, that you're not going to have a strategy-driven, you know, animated artistic scene, you know. That inevitably is going to become institutionalized, and I think that's what's happened to the arts now, you know. Like the Arts Festival is on at the moment. I mean, 30 years ago, if the Arts Festival was on, you were buying season tickets and going to shows. I don't know the last time I went to an Arts Festival show, to tell you the truth, and I have no interest in it now. And it doesn't seem to. I know from between 10 and 20 doing shows and putting on shows around about the town, that the Arts Festival does not in any way percolate over into what you might call social animation and capacity building amongst the population of the town, and particularly the working class population of the town. And this needs to be addressed immediately. I think that the whole 2020 debacle cannot be forgotten. You know, there is a huge amount of money astray from the 2020 budget. Where did that go? We know that it was all front-loaded, like the plan for the water. Front-load all those planning and development things up front and charge plenty of money for them. You know, 20 or 30 years ago, you had to produce that document before anyone was going to even listen to you. It wasn't a question of going out there and being commissioned to write a document. It was a terrible thing. And I think that it broke the confidence too of an awful lot. There's been an awful lot of people involved in the arts in Galway over the last 10 or 15 years. But there isn't the resources there to support them. The plain fact of the matter is that between the Druid, Macnas and the Arts Festival, all the arts money for this neck of the woods is likely to be taken up forever. So the question is, Do you hold on to the status quo, or do you somehow try to change this structure before somebody comes along and changes it? The Galway Arts Festival is no longer what it was. It's no longer the leading arts event in Ireland by a mile. There's plenty of other places now. It has to change. It has to look at itself differently, and that needs to be done immediately, I'd say. Well, I'm living in Gort. I've been out in Gort. I went to Gort about a month before COVID struck, and it was a lovely place to spend COVID. You know, it was quiet and you could walk, and the weather was great that first year. So, and I've been in Gort since. So in Gort I've been doing a good bit of stuff on Yeats, Lady Gregory, Yeats and the role of the Abbey Theatre particularly, but the broader literary revival and the political events that occurred at the time, and particularly 1916. When you talk to any historian, they find it hard to categorise 1916. It doesn't fit into any kind of model, of how these things might work. In the 1930s and 40s, political parties create their own myths that validate their own existence. And everybody has sort of created, there's a Fianna Fáil myth of 1916, and a Fine Gael myth of 1916, a Sinn Féin myth of 1916. But they're all done kind of retrospectively. There was a myth involved in 1916, and Yeats was the man that introduced this in the Abbey. In the early Abbey plays, Yeats's mythic plays, he takes Ireland as the old woman in the old pagan concept of Ireland as a goddess, as the ancient crone who's revitalised by the growing national spirit in the population. And he treats this with Maud Gonne in Kathleen Houlihan. He does it in The Death of Cú Chulainn and The Only Jealousy of Emer, these plays in the Abbey. And he was hoping to tittle the imagination of the bourgeoisie with these kind of plays. And of course the bourgeoisie didn't come. But the people that came were young, with a kind of a radical nationalism, with romanticism, right? This is the language of myth and symbol. This is the language that they wanted to hear. So among the first people in the audience at the early Abbey plays was Pádraig Pearson, his brother, and Thomas MacDonagh and Joseph Plunkett, and these people that were out. These were a scene. They were an arts scene in Dublin. They had no relationship at all in the wide earthly world with the Land League or the other currents of things that we try to run through 1916. They would be known as a scene in Dublin, and that scene gathered about 1900, and by 1913 it provided the resistance to the lockout by the Catholic nationalist bourgeoisie in Dublin, and it led to the formation of Cumann Amán and a whole spirit of intense and radical resistance that was welling up within this group, this Abbey crowd. Now, Yeats and Lady Gregory set out to use this mythology to create this kind of spirit. But Yeats lost interest in the thing itself. He believed that they were, the nationalists were just showing off, that it was all talk, it was all style over substance, and that they weren't going to do anything. And that's an evidence in his play, in 1916. But it was that crowd. So if you were to look at everyone that was out in 1916, they were all the Abbey crowd. The whole cast of the Abbey was there. all the technicians were, everybody employed by the Abbey, and the Abbey audience. They were the ones that went out in 1916. It was a radical romantic movement. And they knew all about the blood sacrifice. But Yeats and the literary movement are involved with this. They were the ones that created that kind of atmosphere. Yeats disowned it, but that's where they came from, and that was their origin. So that's it's a thing that to look at the arts as an item of social change, rather than something that is an entertainment for the bourgeoisie. Art should be like religion. It should be the portal of the spirit. And this is not recognised by our art scene in Galway. Is just an industry, and it's institutionalised, and it's getting more institutionalised. The county council can fix the roads. How are they going to run an arts strategy? How can they hope to do that? And now the university is involved in it. There's a man in charge of a theatre department in the university. I don't think has ever read a script or painted a picture. But this is not art, and we have to look at that. That would be my reflection on it anyway.